There is a bridge in the Florida Keys that runs almost 7 miles out into open ocean and then stops, not ends, stops. A little over 2 miles out, past a small island, a section of steel is simply gone. Cut out, lifted away, and never replaced, leaving a gap above the water that nothing can cross. Everything beyond it, more than 4 miles of roadway standing on concrete piers in the middle of the sea, has been unreachable since 1982. No cars, no people, just a road holding its position over the Gulf of Mexico, going nowhere for 44 years. And here is the part that should not make sense. Florida is still paying for it. In January of 2022, the state finished a $44 million restoration of the piece You Can Still Walk and signed a 30-year maintenance agreement budgeted at $77 million. For a bridge that carries no traffic, that collects no toll, that leads to a 5-acre island and then quits. A dead bridge is supposed to be the one thing a state cannot wait to knock down. This one, Florida decided to keep at enormous expense, 30 feet away from the modern highway that made it obsolete. So hold that question. Why does a country pay to keep a road that goes nowhere? We will open that up at the end. This is the story of the old 7-mile bridge, built as a railroad by a man who was almost blind, reborn as a highway because of a hurricane that did not actually destroy it, retired for being too narrow, and now the most expensive sidewalk in the United States. To understand why anyone built it, you have to understand what Key West was in 1905. It was, at that moment, the largest city in Florida, bigger than Miami, bigger than Tampa. Cigars, sponges, salvage, 90 miles of water between it and Havana, and no land connection to anything. Everything in and out went by ship, and the Panama Canal was coming. When it opened, cargo from the Pacific would round into the Gulf, and whichever American port sat closest to that shipping lane would take an enormous share of it. Key West sat closer than any other deep water port in the country. It just had no railroad. The man who decided to build one was Henry Flagler. He had made a fortune as John D. Rockefeller's partner in Standard Oil, and then spent the second half of his life laying track down the east coast of Florida and building hotels at the end of it. By 1905, he was 75 years old, and he proposed running a railroad 128 miles across open saltwater, island to island, to a city that half the country could not find on a map. The press called it Flagler's Folly. Work began that year, and the conditions were exactly as bad as the critics predicted. Crews lived on houseboats and in camps on scraps of coral. There was no fresh water, so it was shipped in. There were mosquitoes in numbers that stopped work entirely on some days. Hurricanes came through 5 times during construction, 3 of them causing serious damage and killing men. The chief engineer, Joseph Meredith, worked himself into the ground and died in 1909 before the line was finished. His deputy, William Crome, took over and carried it the rest of the way. The hardest single piece was the crossing between Knight's Key and Little Duck Key. Nearly 7 miles of open water, deep enough and busy enough that it had to be built in 4 separate structures with a steel swing span in the middle, so boats could pass between the Atlantic and the Gulf. Its formal name was the Knight's Key, Pigeon Key, Moser Channel, and Moser Channel Bridge, which nobody has ever said out loud twice. Everyone called it the 7-mile bridge. The construction camp sat on Pigeon Key, 5 acres of rock underneath the span, and at its peak, 400 men lived there. Quick note, if you are getting something out of this, the best thing you can do is watch it through or hit subscribe. That is it. Back to the bridge. On January 21st, 1912, the line was declared complete, and the next morning, Flagler's private car rolled into Key West. He was 82 and nearly blind. School children had been lined up along the track to cheer, and he could hear them but could not see them. And he said exactly that out loud, in tears, on the platform. It had cost about $50 million of his own money. The newspapers that had called it a folly now called it the eighth wonder of the world. He died 16 months later. And then the arithmetic arrived, the way it always does. The Panama Canal freight never came to Key West. The shipping companies routed it elsewhere. The sponge beds were exhausted. The cigar industry had already moved to Tampa. Flagler had predicted Key West would grow to 50,000 people. By 1920, it was 18,749 and falling. The trains that crossed the 7-mile bridge carried coal, fruit, building materials, and tank cars full of drinking water because the islands had none of their own. The most ambitious railroad in America was hauling water to the customers it had built itself to serve. And by the 1930s, the Florida East Coast Railway was in receivership. Which brings us to the night everyone remembers, and to the thing about that night that almost nobody gets right. On September 2nd, 1935, a small, extremely intense hurricane came ashore in the Upper Keys. It remains the strongest storm ever recorded, making landfall in the United States. Central pressure of 892 millibars. Sustained winds near 185 miles an hour. A storm surge of 16 to 20 feet, moving across islands that stood a few feet above sea level. In 3 camps on Windley Key and Lower Matecumbe Key, the federal government had housed several hundred World War I veterans, working relief jobs building a highway. These were men from the Bonus Army, the ones who had marched on Washington in 1932 and been driven out at bayonet point. Now they were living in wooden shacks and tents on a sandbar. There was an evacuation plan. It depended on a train. The order to send it went out from Miami in the early afternoon, and everything that could go wrong did. The train had to wait for a drawbridge over the Miami River that was raised for holiday boat traffic. At Homestead, the locomotive had to be turned around so its headlight would face the right way coming back. At Windley Key, the cab struck a power cable that had sagged across the tracks, and it took the better part of an hour to cut loose. The train reached Islamorada a little before 8:30 in the evening. The surge arrived at almost the same moment and rolled the entire consist off the rails. Only the locomotive was heavy enough to stay upright. The official death toll is 485. Some counts put it lower, around 408. Roughly 260 of the dead were veterans. So many bodies were recovered in the days after that authorities cremated them on piers at Snake Creek, and the ashes were later sealed into a stone crypt at Islamorada, where the monument still stands. Ernest Hemingway, who was living in Key West and went out with the rescue boats, wrote an essay about it for a magazine called The New Masses. He titled it, "Who Murdered the Vets?" But here is the detail that changes the whole story. The storm did not destroy the 7-mile bridge. It destroyed about 42 miles of track in the Upper Keys, most of it embankment. The ordinary dirt and rock the rails sat on across the low islands. The big engineered structures, the viaducts and the concrete piers and the steel spans came through with damage that was minor by comparison. They had been overbuilt by a man with a wise and well-guarded disregard for cost, and they held. What broke was not the bridge. What broke was the company. The Florida East Coast Railway, already bankrupt, looked at rebuilding 42 miles of roadbed to serve a route that had never once paid for itself, and declined. The Key West extension was finished after 23 years. And then the state of Florida did something opportunistic and brilliant. It bought the entire right-of-way, every surviving bridge and viaduct, 128 miles of the eighth wonder of the world, for $640,000. Then it paved it. Understand what that actually involved. The railroad deck was 11 feet wide, because a train only needs 1 lane. A highway needs 2. So engineers bolted cantilevered crossbeams out from the sides of the original structure and hung a concrete roadway on them, widening 11 feet to 22. And when they pulled up Flagler's rails, they did not scrap them. They painted them white and bolted them back along the edges as guardrails. For 44 years, everyone who drove to Key West did it, protected by the railroad that used to be underneath them. The Overseas Highway opened in 1938, and if you are old enough to have driven the original, you already know what the rest of this paragraph says. 22 feet total, 2 lanes, no shoulder, no median, a low concrete curb, and then the ocean on both sides for 7 miles. Oncoming trucks, nowhere to go. At Bahia Honda, it was worse, because there, the road was built on top of the steel truss, so you drove a narrow ribbon 40 feet in the air with the girders flashing past your mirrors. And in the middle of the 7-mile bridge sat the swing span. When a boat wandered through Moser Channel, the span rotated open, and every car on that bridge stopped and waited. Not at an intersection, not in a town. In the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, engine idling, water on all sides, waiting for a shrimp boat. You also paid for the privilege. There were toll booths on Big Pine Key and Lower Matacumba Key until April of 1954. That road carried the Keys for a generation, and then the same thing happened that always happens. It could not grow. Cars got wider and traffic got heavier, and 22 feet stayed 22 feet. Between 1978 and 1982, a new 7-mile bridge went up alongside the old one. Precast concrete box girder, 440 spans, an arch in the middle, giving 65 feet of clearance, so no boat would ever stop a car again. About $45 million. It opened on May 24th, 1982, and it was, at the time, the longest bridge of its kind in the world. It also did not go to Pigeon Key. The new alignment bypasses the island entirely, so the state kept the old bridge, not out of sentiment at first, but because 5 acres of historic buildings under the span still needed a road, and because the old structure was already listed on the National Register, and because taking down almost 7 miles of concrete standing inside what is now a national marine sanctuary is a far more expensive and destructive proposition than leaving it up. The piers had been down there for 70 years by then. Corral had grown on them. And once the new bridge opened, the swing span came out. It was a navigation hazard with no purpose left, so it was removed, and the gap it left has never been filled. Which is the answer to the question from the beginning. Florida pays to keep it because it can no longer afford to do anything else, and because the 2.25 miles from Marathon out to Pigeon Key turned out to be one of the most beloved public spaces in the state. People fished from it, ran on it, watched the sunrise from it, and drove out to the island until 2008, when the unsupported cantilevered sections, the ones added in the 1930s, began to visibly sag. It closed on July 5th, 2016. It stayed closed for 2,017 days. The restoration cost $44 million, inside a 30-year program budgeted at $77 million, and it reopened on January 12th, 2022, to pedestrians and cyclists only. Everything west of the missing span is still out there, and still unreachable, and will be for as long as it stands. Now here is the last thing, and it is the detail that says the most about all of it. The 7-mile bridge has never been 7 miles long. The original 4 structures added up to about 6.7. The 1982 replacement measures 35,862 feet, which is 6.79 miles. It is shorter than the bridge it replaced. The most famous span in Florida is named after a distance it does not cover, built for freight that never arrived, at a port that never grew, by a man who could not see it finished. And it is still standing in 2 pieces over water that does not care either way. A road does not fail. The reason for the road fails, and the road stays where it is. If you want to see it, go to mile marker 47 in Marathon and start walking. The modern highway is on your left, moving. The old one is under your feet, not moving. And the white rails along the edge of some of these old spans in the Keys are the last thing Henry Flagler left behind, laid down for trains, painted for cars, and now holding back nobody at all. If you ever drove the old overseas highway before 1982, if you sat in the middle of the Gulf waiting for the swing bridge to close, if your family lived in the Keys before the storm, or if someone in your family worked those camps, tell me in the comments what you remember. The people who knew this road carry pieces of the story that no archive ever will. And if you found this one worth your time, hit subscribe. There are a lot more roads like it.